So on our last two videos, we talked about the origins of your campaign setting and then the Pantheon. But now that we have our basic world established, let's talk about ways to spice it up, particularly with factions. Now, factions are pretty broad in what they encompass. Everything from political entities, clerical entities, business entities, extremist groups, etc. Political entities are about those who are in power or important or want to bring up particular political ideals that aren't or are being addressed. To list a few more, there's monastic orders, criminal organizations, networks, cults, religious groups, law enforcement, political and alliance type groups, guilds and business related ones, ones created on race or culture, scientific groups, mercenary and adventurous groups for hire, and so on. These types of guilds, factions, etc. help flesh out the world and show there is more going on than just what the party is doing. Each group has their own agenda. Factions are, of course, groups put together because everyone involved in them have like-minded goals. And all these different people who have one thing in common bring different things to the table, which, sort of like an assembly line. They each bring something different, and as a whole, they work very well together. You have, for a criminal organization, you have spies that kind of scout out the area. You have smugglers to actually get the supplies. You have people who bribe or pretend to be officers in order to help the smugglers and so on avoid detection. There are different cogs in these factions that make them work. There are multiple types of these types of faction entities. One is those who have sort of a shared knowledge or ability, like how guilds keep the secret of their craft and kind of only those with such talent or notoriety can be allowed into and access into that guild. Scholars or these types of entities also would kind of fall along that same line based off of what kind of group it is. There are some who want to spread information freely, but others are more exclusive. The second type of faction would be one that's main motivation or interaction with power. These would be idealist groups who want to make a message to the power or gain more power in whatever ideal they want to have expressed in this political entity. These idealist groups sometimes are more revolutionaries and end up overthrowing the old leadership. Sometimes nobles banding together to keep their own power. The church can even have a sway over what the king will say and do by the Pope supporting, or whatever your leader of the church is called, supporting a certain political ideal, which if the king goes against that agenda, he's not going to look good. And the third type of faction, its goal is not power or about knowledge, but rather simply money. These are adventuring groups, mercenary groups, any business types, etc. Pretty simple when it comes to these types of factions. Oftentimes, these factions or groups will like to make alliances, whether in public or secret, advance their own ambitions, and this shows that it is a moving and changing world. All these factions, of course, band together because they have ambitions, and they'll try to achieve their goals that they're working towards. Now, what's interesting is that they can have a public goal, and then they can have a private ambition. So these work for groups that are fronts, ones that are criminal organizations that are more nefarious than they're letting on to, etc. Also, no matter how many guilds you put, don't throw them all at your players at once. Slowly introduce them in your world. There'll be a lot of time for that, and you can come up more as time goes on. Also, like I've mentioned before in the deity video, working with your players to create factions that they would be involved with is also another way to create these. For example, your monk's monastic order, cleric's clerical order, rogue shadow organization, and so on. There are various ways that these groups achieve the goals they want to achieve, such as a political group might make alliances to gain more power. A protester group might, of course, do protest. As I mentioned, these factions have goals they want to achieve, but there are various ways to do this. One is a very wealthy group could gain power by spending money and making alliances. Others, such as more political-oriented ones, like sort of protesting groups, could do protests to kind of gain awareness, a secret kind of uprising if it's more of a rebellion, whether it's, you know, violent or non-violent protests, things like that. And then you have like terrorist groups, which is very extreme, and so on. Gaining a monetary goal is one of the most simplest ones. You know, of course, for a shadow organization, this could be through smuggling or whatnot and grift. If it's an adventuring organization, they would send out, you know, smaller adventuring parties to go get money, and they take a fraction of their cut. There are so many ways for these factions to achieve their goals, and you should know that when you create said factions. Also, the leadership of a group may be one you want to find important. For example, maybe it is run by sort of an elitist group, or maybe that excludes even certain races or religions, or an idealistic one, which is maybe more idealistic than some of its older followers want to be. It could even be corrupt. It could be led by a doppelganger who's pretending to be someone else. It could keep changing hands, but under the same name, like the Dread Pirate Roberts in The Princess Bride. Or, to use one example from my own campaign setting, the Tusk, which is actually a group that started to attempt to control hunting by basically making it into a organized group, because they were over hunting and things were bad. So the leaders, their goal is different than the hunters. The hunters want to hunt and kill things, but the leaders, secretly, they want to cause restraint on that hunting. Also, the origins of a group could be important. Maybe there is a vigilante law enforcement group that started because they were old war veterans who were not treated well by their government, so they decided to continue what they know best, which is engaging in combat, whether that be vigilantism or maybe even banditry. They could have been an adventuring group that got, you know, so rich and wealthy that they decided to settle down, and now they finance smaller groups. Anything goes with this. Now, you can create a symbol for your factions. This is, of course, very unnecessary, but it, you know, helps flesh your world and make it seem cool if you have the time to do said things. Now, this is a nicer touch, though, for some of the more secretive organizations. For example, you know, a rebellion group might have tattoos of, like, a fist, so that when they, you know, you see, or a symbol they make, like, you know, they kind of go up like this whenever they see other members. Or you have another group who has maybe some sort of special ring on their finger, something that is a little bit secretive, but those who are also part of it can easily identify who else is a member of their group. Similar to some of the unnecessary things we talked about with the deities, a slogan is another thing that you could have, or, you know, symbols and catchphrases, etc. You can also make, you know, similar to sort of a piety system for your deities. You can do what the Dungeon Master's Guide and Guild Master's Guide Ravnica does with these factions and guild, is favor with said guild. What's even more interesting, maybe, is you have favor and then disfavor. Every time you do a job or help that faction out, you gain favor. But maybe that faction has an enemy. Maybe certain things you do have ramifications, which the players may not know or be able to really figure out immediately, but the things they do will have positive benefits, maybe, and also negative consequences, which will sort of, eventually knowing these things, will determine their actions and shape it in a different and unique way. Probably a very important thing to know is the size of the faction. Are they small and growing? If so, this is a great chance for your players to get in early as it grows and maybe gain up in rank very quickly. Or large and growing would be very hard, or just large and stagnant would be a lot harder to raise the ranks of. But it's very more prevalent, and, you know, you can go to any major city and find people from that faction there. Also, there is large and destabilizing. These are, of course, some, you know, nobles whose former glory is fading as the governments are changing, or if sort of religion does not have the same prevalence it did back then, they could be fading. You could either maybe assist these groups to rise up, or even the players can choose to let them fall down if they view them as corrupt, and that is why they're falling down. Also, if your players are high enough level, why not start their own guilds? And that could be very interesting, especially for like a campaign setting that you have multiple games go in, because then your players will actually make an impact on the world, and later, if you time skip 30 years later and have a different group, then that group will have the faction the players were created will have grown and become a part of the world, which I think is a really awesome chance for sort of the impact of the players to be more impactful. Again, surprisingly, there's a lot of things that kind of fall similar to the deity video, which is sort of the favor and sort of how different factions view each other. Some form alliances or have similar goals. Some hate each other. These interactions and relationships add for different narrative hooks and so on. For example, some more extremist political factions could be banned in certain areas. Again, like also rebellious factions, of course, would have to be underground. Militaristic factions could be warring to each other, or there's different rival spy organizations which are both trying to gain favor with a third. Now consider what kind of functions the factions need to run. There's a lot of ifs in that sense. Is there conflicts or infighting within the guilds? Struggles with ideals or who's in power? Is there a code it follows? Etc. This allows you to find what people and issues are important to your faction and what the players will eventually latch on to, interact with, and learn about these factions. These are the important things that you should know and your players will eventually know. Now, just to give some examples of some maybe interesting factions, at least I hope, I'm going to list some of my own creation, that is. So we're going to start with the Sisterhood of Chiaroscuro, a group of artists and poets and playwrights who all celebrate and mourn the deity Dawn Reaper, a deity who attempted to give more life to all, and sort of this age of longevity it was called. But the death domain god, Corvus, grew jealous of the lack of souls that fell into his arms, because people were thriving, not getting as much disease or even dying as often. So he decided to make a bet with Dawn Reaper. They would each choose a mortal, and whoever lived the longest would win. Dawn Reaper lost, and she was banished into the grave domain. Now, everyone who loved the age of longevity mourns for that age and wishes to reclaim it, embracing passion, living to the fullest, and living life like they would die the next day. They feel emotions deeper, are almost hedonistic in the way that they take in life. And sort of this is how they're very full of passion and love the arts. And that's sort of this. So basically the goal of this group is just to live life to the fullest. It's not, they don't really wish to advance or have any particular motivations. They're just they're a very culture-based faction. Next is the Librum Institute. This is my twist on the typical scholarly institution. So instead of more aloof scholars, they are very involved in their community. They go door to door, spreading, giving pamphlets about knowledge and giving out free books to the poor and public, putting on plays which are educational, patronizing education. Basically, they're very into promoting education to those who have been denied it. They are like a split off sect of a more cloistered and exclusive group who had almost, there was almost like a spiritual awakening, almost akin to like a religious split or diversion, which allowed them to kind of have this mission to spread knowledge. So their goal, of course, is to patronize knowledge and spread it to everyone. And they do this through patronization, plays, etc. And the third, you got your criminal organization, the Qualicon, a criminal and spy organization that has grown so powerful and that has so many authorities that make deals with it, and sort of there's so much graft going on that some turn many authorities turn a blind eye to it because it has become a working cog in the machine for many of these governments. Their goal is to, of course, attain more influence and power through grafts and more influence, and they've been very successful in this. There's the Mortogasts. This is the shadow of shadow, basically, an organization so secret that many question even if it exists. Its members hold an extreme influence over basically the entire government as a whole, and the members vary from the most powerful people in all of the world to people with particular skill sets. Also, anyone who finds out who one of the Murtugast members is and is able to find their meeting place will instantly be allowed access into the organization, but that has only happened once. They're almost kind of the, you're, I guess the best way to describe it is sort of like an Illuminati organization where they kind of, they're the puppet masters of the world, but they're not too involved. The Order of the Worthy, a cleric group, or also kind of monastic, that chooses, they're very exclusive in their healing, choosing who lives and dies, choosing not to save people, even if they have the chance to, because they view them as bad people and the world is better without them. So, again, these factions are not cut and dry. To some, this may seem like very radical. Oh, you can't heal everyone, but for some, they heal that sick child, but they let that murderer die. Maybe there's something to this. Also, the Qualicon, many view it as bad, but the entire government's kind of relying on this craft. For example, many of the poor folk can get access to protection by simply giving their votes away to members of the Qualicon, and also smuggling in magic items and being able to buy it that they wouldn't have access to otherwise. So there are benefits to these very sort of shadowy and gray morality organizations, which allow for interesting questions. And I think that those sorts of goals and motivations are very interesting in some ways because of they attract different people and their effect on the world is prevalent, and whether the players like it or not. And if they remove it, there will definitely be consequences. Once again, factions are one of the best ways to bring political intrigue into your game. They can also set up you can also set up groups this way that give your players jobs and tasks to help the storyline move forward, or even make the faction part of what the sort of enemies of the campaign are a part of. I think factions for me are very fun just to design in general, and I like adding them in when it comes to world building in your campaign, and kind of makes a fleshed out, more full world.